Good evening. My name is Alena. I am a life coach with a background in psychology. The idea we are going to discuss in the next few minutes is about one of the most dreadful consequences of adverse situations on us humans. But before we talk about humans, let's talk about monkeys. Once upon a time, in a distant imaginary jungle, lived two monkey tribes. They were bitter enemies, fighting each other every day. But the interesting part is that monkeys looked exactly the same, except for one small detail. The monkeys of the first tribe had long tails, and the monkeys of the other tribe had short tails. Their fights continued until the wise king of the jungle came up with an extremely simple solution. He forced all the monkeys to cover their tails. As you can imagine, all fights immediately stopped, simply because now monkeys couldn't differentiate their own tribe members from the other tribe members. This is how superficial and artificial their perception of each other as enemies was. It's sad to confess, but humans are no different. Look next to you and across this hall. Here today we have all kinds of races and nationalities. Imagine we could cover the colors of our eyes, hair, and skin. We would look exactly the same. Nevertheless, around the world we see a lot of conflicts between human beings, all based on seeing each other as enemies. Let me give you one of the most recent examples. With the outburst of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we've seen a rise in prejudice towards the Asian people, simply because COVID was first discovered in China. Because of that, people from different Asian countries experienced unfriendly attitudes due to this global crisis. Newspapers were flooded with headlines like COVID-19 fueling anti-Asian racism and xenophobia worldwide. By August 2021, American media NPR has reported over 9,000 anti-Asian incidents in the US alone since the beginning of the pandemic. Why is this happening to us? Why do people have a need to divide other human beings into enemies and allies? Well, the mechanism that I call looking for an enemy is actually a very old evolutionary survival mechanism. According to Sigmund Freud, this mechanism is a regressive response to a new situation, meaning to say that when people are put in an extremely stressful condition, they tend to give an archaic response to it. Let's try to understand what it means. Imagine a prehistoric human that lives in a cave. Every tiny scratch or murmur or sound outside that cave could mean a fatal threat. At that time, being on high alert and treating everything in the vicinity as a potential enemy would mean survival and safety. Who knows, maybe it's a hungry tiger looking for blood, or an unfriendly member of a neighboring tribe. The most dangerous creature hiding in the dark was another human being. So we learned to treat our differences, sometimes the most tiny ones, as potential threat. In today's situations of adversity, humans tend to react exactly like our ancestors would. When something is threatening our safety and well-being, we strive to identify the enemy behind the threat. And the more turbulent the situation is, the more stubbornly we hold on to the belief that this group of people are the villains. George Orwell wrote about this massive misconception in 1945 in his notes on nationalism. It's a habit of assuming that human beings can be classified like insects and that whole groups of millions of people can be confidently labeled as good or bad. In other words, divided in enemies and allies. Research by psychology professor Mark Landau has shown that when people are given a certain enemy to think about, we tend to see the world as more safe and less chaotic. Let's see what it means with our example with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic is a global uncontrollable event. Of course, together as a society, we can limit the spread of the disease. But for each and every one of us as an individual, this event is uncontrollable. Therefore, it boosts our stress levels and anxiety levels very high. So when we identify a group of people that is supposedly responsible for the situation, we start falsely interpreting an uncontrollable event as a controllable. Therefore, we feel more safe and less uncertain. In other words, our psyche requires an enemy responsible for the negativity around us. It helps us maintain more predictable view of this world. But let me assure you, it doesn't serve us well in the long run. If humans stuck to this ancient survival strategy, we would still live in caves, afraid of each other. Our psyche can focus on one thing at a time. We can either focus on identifying and defeating an enemy, or we can focus on cooperating, evolving, and creating. If our ancestors didn't cooperate, didn't learn to work together, we wouldn't enjoy the civilization we have today. Groundbreaking inventions like light bulb, aeroplanes, and television wouldn't be possible without cooperation of inventors and scientists from different countries. Being here today in this multinational community, I believe it's crucial to leave behind the looking for an enemy mindset and start treating our differences as a blessing, as an enhancement of each other rather than a potential threat. Let's see how we can move away from this mindset. When we see somebody or a certain group of people as an enemy, we dehumanize them. This means that we stop seeing them as similar human beings with the same qualities, desires, and aspirations. So to move away from this mindset, we shall do exactly the opposite. We shall strive to see people free from their group associations and common stereotypes, but rather as individuals with similar qualities, with similar desires and shortcomings. I've seen an interesting implementing of this approach in a book, Enemies on a Couch, by psychiatrist Vamik Volkan. Dr. Volkan dedicated his life to help establish dialogues between conflicting nations. Early in his career, he participated in facilitating dialogue between Egyptian delegation and Israeli delegation. The dialogue was tough and difficult, as both sides would see each other solely as representatives of the enemy side. This was the case until the representative of Egypt consulted the Quran. There he found a passage that mentioned that Moses was afraid. In Ayah 45, chapter 20, when God asks Moses to go and speak to the Pharaoh, he and his brother reply, "We fear that he may hasten to do evil to us." The point here is that Moses, just like any other human being, just like the delegate from Egypt himself, could experience simple human emotions, the emotion of fear. This helped the representative of Egypt realize that Israeli representatives could feel exactly the same like he did. This simple realization was a game changer for their previously stunned dialogue, because now they were able to see each other as similar human beings, rather than solely as representatives of the enemy side. But let's move away from relationships between nations and big groups of people and see how the enemy mindset influences our personal lives. In our personal lives, we adopt this mindset simply when we focus on the cause of the problem instead of the solution. In other words, I call it the problem mindset. Let me explain you how it works on a simple metaphor. Let's say you fell in the hole in the ground. You're there at the bottom and you're not able to come out of it by yourself. I see you, and instead of giving you a hand, I come and I ask you, "How did you get inside?" And we spend hours discussing that you should have been more careful, that you should have looked under your feet, but it doesn't help you to get out of that hole. Our parents do it sometimes, don't they? Now imagine I came to you and I simply gave you a hand. What a game changer. This is how it works when we change our focus from the cause of the problem to the solution of it. The problem mindset, focusing on who is guilty rather than how to fix this, is also extremely damaging for our personal relationships. Sometimes this prioritization can damage our relationships beyond repair, simply because when we see somebody as responsible for our problems, as responsible for negativity around us, we attribute all the negative traits to that person. We look at them through a magnifying glass of bias, forgetting everything good about that person, and turning him from a real human being into an imaginary antagonist. Obviously, it's hard to build a flourishing relationship with somebody who we've classified as bad. Let's do a simple experiment. I will ask you a few questions, and if you ever thought something like this ever in your life, I will just ask you with all your honesty to raise your hand. First of all, raise your hand if you ever thought, this is my parents' fault, or this is because my parents did something or never did something for me. Yeah, you see, sometimes our psyche is looking for somebody responsible for our problems. The second statement, raise your hand if you ever thought, I'm not good enough. Everybody guilty. All right. Now this second statement shows us that sometimes we are looking for the enemy inside our own selves. So many of us live with a deep belief that there is something fundamentally imperfect within ourselves and our personalities that must be fought and defeated. Have you heard the phrase, you're your worst enemy? Personally, I hope it will be banned one day. This mindset became new age plague with the invention of television and then social media. Daily we are bombarded by thousands of messages from TV shows, movies, and most of all Instagram stories. That we must have $1 million on our bank accounts. We must have a sport car, attractive spouse. Every morning we must jump out of bed, full of joy, take an ice-cold bath, and go on a 10 kilometers run. All while founding another company and making another $1 million, all before lunch. And if we are not like that, then we are procrastinators and losers, and we must immediately fix ourselves and jump back on track. And people spend years fighting their negative beliefs, their personality flaws, their past trauma. I see it in my coaching practice every day. If only I could beat my procrastination. If only I could make more money. But no matter how hard we fight, we can't win. Simply because it doesn't make us feel satisfied or happy, because our focus is always on the problem rather than the beauty of the current moment. It's on what we don't have rather than what we shall be grateful for. It's on our flaws rather than our strengths and gifts. Imagine you were born today. There is no past experience, no personality issues, no childhood trauma. There is no enemy inside you. You are already okay. How would that feel? Before I leave this stage, I want to leave you with a story. Once upon a time, in Spain, lived a man called Alonso. Alonso was a member of Spanish nobility, so he wouldn't spend his days in hard work, farming, rather in a library, reading books about chivalry. And Alonso had a dream. He wanted to be a real knight. So he found an old suit of armor, recruited a neighboring squire as farmer as a squire, and headed towards adventures. However, you can't be a real knight unless you have an enemy to fight. The problem was there were no enemies. The dragons, the angry giants, and sneaky enchanters he read about in his books were simply non-existent. But Alonso was determined to find an enemy, and indeed he found one. A huge, dangerous, angry windmill. And he defeated it with the utmost honor and grace. Of course, bringing more harm than good and making us laugh up until today. I invite you to throw away your suit of armor and stop fighting the windmills. Practice this simple but fundamental change in mindset. Don't look for an enemy, both outside of yourself and inside. Don't focus on where you have been. Focus on where you want to go. Don't focus on what you want to fight. Focus on what you want to create. Thank you.